Peter is a 75-year-old man that walked into my office looking straight at the floor. His main issue was he could no longer go to the restaurants he wanted because he couldn't pick his head up to eat. Going to restaurants was the thing he enjoyed the most. He was pretty much an amateur restaurant critic, but over the last 5 years, he had noticed his head had just been dropping more and more forward to the point that it was literally resting on his chest. He wasn't having any other symptoms. He wasn't having any arm tingling, no weakness in the arms. He wasn't having any leg tingling or numbness. Just he wasn't able to hold his head upright. So at this point, I had a suspicion for a certain condition. I got x-rays, I sent him for neurologic testing with a neurologist. We got MRIs and CT scans of his entire spine. And let me show you what we found. So the MRIs showed that Peter had no spinal cord issues. He didn't have any compression of his spinal cord. He didn't have any compression of the nerves. Frankly, that was what I was suspecting. The CT scan, however, showed that he had multiple regions of his spine that had fused themselves together in a very forward or kyphotic position. The other thing that the MRI showed was that the muscles in the back of Peter's neck were very weak. So I had a suspicion that Peter had something called a dropped head syndrome. Dropped head syndrome is a condition where, for most of the time, completely unknown reasons, the head drops almost all the way down, sometimes to the point that it's touching the chin. We believe this happens due to some type of weakness in the extensor muscles, which are the muscles that hold your head upright and the muscles that are really in the back of your neck. But the reason that these muscles get weak and the reason why it happens rapidly, a lot of times we can't figure it out. Even with the best neurologic testing, and even if we can figure out where or why the muscles are getting weak, many times there's also not a treatment. So overall, it's a really tough condition. But not only did Peter have a dropped head syndrome, also he had a hyperkyphosis of the thoracic spine. So what kyphosis means is a forward curvature of the spine. Hyper means that it was excessive for his particular anatomy. And thoracic spine means it's the part of the spine that forms the rib cage. His kyphosis had gotten so bad that the spine was actually starting to fuse itself together in this region as well. So the degeneration from the kyphosis was so bad that he had lost the disc spaces and the bones were fused and touching each other. So let me show you what the x-rays looked like. So looking at Peter from a whole body perspective, we can see that his chin was nearly completely on his chest. This was as far up as he was able to bring his neck when you asked him to stand upright. He had this accentuated kyphosis, meaning this forward curvature, and all these bones were fused together. In exchange, he actually had a lot of lordosis, which is backwards curvature of the lumbar or the lower part of the spine. So overall, when you looked at him, he was still able to stand upright because of the way the lower part of the spine was compensating for the curvatures in the upper part of the spine. And you can see that when he was standing upright looking forward, you can almost see that we just see the top of his head right there. So he had a pretty dramatic problem. Peter was 75 years old, or is 76 now. And at the time, didn't have any major medical problems. He didn't have any major heart conditions or lung conditions. But the fact that he was so debilitated by this condition had left him pretty weak. So before we considered any surgery, I really had him maximize his physical therapy. He went to physical therapy for months to try to strengthen the back of the neck muscles, to try to strengthen his overall body, try to strengthen the legs and the arms, hopefully get him in the best possible shape, get him in the best condition possible, so that if he ended up undergoing a surgery, he'd be as strong as possible, or hopefully he could get himself stronger where maybe he wouldn't even need a surgery. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to do so. So even though he had made himself in the best shape possible, he still could not pick his neck up. He still could not pick his head up. And he was left with a tough decision because the type of surgery that we were looking at was going to be a big one. It was probably something where we were going to need to fuse most of his spine in order to correct both problems. After all, we had to correct the forward curvature of the thoracic spine, and we had to correct his head drop where the head was coming down. So I thought he was at least going to need a fusion going from the top of his neck down to most of his thoracic spine. Considering that his spine was fused in the thoracic region, I also thought he was going to need something called an osteotomy, which means a cut in the bone in order to correct the spine. For him, there was several types of osteotomies I was considering, but I'll show you the one that we ended up doing in the end. Now, I think the most important part of my discussion with Peter was that even though I thought we could potentially get away with doing a fusion of the cervical and the thoracic part, I was very worried that this would cause a lot of stress to the bottom of his spine and that he would need a fusion all the way down. I told him that the chances of needing that fusion all the way down was probably 50-50, but again, it was really hard to say. However, he wanted to start with doing what I thought was possibly the most limited thing possible, and then if he needed more surgery, we would do it at that point. So that was the strategy we chose. Here's what we did. We did something called a corner osteotomy in Peter's spine. We did that in the thoracic spine at the very top of where the forward curve was, or what we call the apex of the kyphosis. Now, what a corner osteotomy is where we cut off sort of the corner of one of the vertebral bodies, and then by cutting off that corner, we compress like that. So it opens the bone in the front and closes the bone in the back. By doing so, we were able to get a substantial reduction in the forward curvature or kyphosis of his thoracic spine. However, we had to extend the fusion all the way up to his neck in order to restore the alignment in the upper part of his neck. Fortunately, the neck was flexible, so we didn't need to do any osteotomies or significant bone cuts in the neck. However, about 3 months from this surgery, even though we stopped at the bottom right here, he started to fail, which I thought may happen. So we ended up having to extend his fusion all the way down to the bottom of his spine. So this is how he is standing now. He's a 1.5 years out from surgery compared to how he was standing before. He's certainly much happier. He's able to go to the restaurants that he wanted to. His spine is expectedly extremely stiff, but he's much happier than he was before the surgery, and he's glad he did it. So even though it was a long road, even though it involved rehab after the initial surgery and rehab after the second surgery, at this point he's been well recovered, and the thing that bothers him the most is actually his knee.